Pitirim Sorokin's heritage. The heritage of Pitirim Sorokin can be considered from two standpoints. The first in reference to his academic achievements, and the second in relation to other aspects of his unusually creative life. In her memoir, his wife Yelena Petrovna explained that he budgeted his time effectively because of his ability to work intensively and his care to use his time productively. Professional sociologists would be interested primarily in Sorokin's academic heritage, and I would suggest that this recognizes 1. His very wide take on the whole field of sociology, as can be seen in his masterwork, Social and Cultural Dynamics. 2. His active participation in many topics covered by the traditional subdisciplines. 3. His success in opening up new areas for research. And 4. His maintenance of high critical standards in his own work and an expectation to find the same in the work of others. Factors contributing to this heritage. Pitirim was born in the rural north of Russia in 1889, where a mixed population of Komis and Russians lived peaceably together. He came endowed with great mental capacity, and in this land it could be developed because education was generally respected there, as shown by a high level of literacy among the people. Sharing his father's itinerant life, Pitirim received whatever schooling that was available, but he learned still more from extensive reading over a wide range of topics. By his 21st year, he had written a few successful essays, as well as occasional poems on diverse topics. He retained manual skills learned during childhood and continued to employ them effectively well into his 70s. Growing social problems and unrest increasingly captured his attention, and ultimately his commitment to work in the social sciences. The earth-shattering events through which he lived, the horrors of World War I, the 1917 revolution, subsequent famine, and other calamities, and his direct experience as a member of the provisional government in Petrograd only sharpened his interest in macro-sociology, and by the time of his banishment in 1922, he had much experience of wars and revolutions. Pitirim left Russia as a fully university-trained academician, credited with an already impressive list of published monographs and books. In Prague, he drafted a handwritten version of the Sociology of Revolution in Russian, to be succeeded by a definitive edition in English soon after he had emigrated to the United States. This was the first of several sociological subdisciplines he added to the field. Personal attributes. In the United States, people meeting Sorokin at once noticed how distinct from them he seemed, somewhat perhaps as citizens in small-town Maine regarded the subject in Edwin Arlington Robinson's poem Flamand. The man Flamand, from God knows where, with firm address and foreign air, with news of nation in his talk and something royal in his walk, with glint of iron in his eyes, but never doubt nor yet surprise, appeared and stayed and held his head as one by kings accredited. Pitirim certainly had a strong personality, and on meeting him, one of my former students said that he could feel the electricity that seemed to surround him as he entered the room. For almost everyone, My father's manners were unfailingly respectful, courteous, and without any note of condescension, no matter to whom he was speaking or whatever station in life that person might have held, always provided that he was treated in a similar way. By the time my parents had moved to Winchester, Massachusetts, and their 2 sons were born, the Sorokins had become well integrated into our middle-class neighborhood, whose inhabitants mostly worked at local businesses. But it also included a second Harvard professor's family next door, as well as scions from several old New England families, some of whom were unemployed during our Great Depression. That aside, their main interest seemed to lie in developing new plant varieties and maintaining their own beautiful gardens. As we began planting the hillside next to our house, Pitirim could often be discovered digging out the places for newly arrived azaleas and rhododendrons, or be seen carrying up the soil and mulch in which to plant them. At other times, he might be found discussing gardening matters with one or another of our horticulture-savvy neighbors. His garden became an important part of his local heritage, and ultimately, its springtime blossoming became an annual event. Now, a living garden is ephemeral, but we have continued trying as best we can to maintain the garden as it appeared during its peak years in the 1950s. On the 1st of June in 1988, 20 years after Pitirim's death, a letter addressed to householders came through the mail slot. It said, "Dear Madam, Sir, I do not know your name, but I want to say thanks to you for your extraordinary azaleas. My wife and I were nearby yesterday evening, and we stopped to look. Your garden is glorious, a gift to the community. Best wishes, sincerely yours, Anthony Lewis." Lewis was a noted public intellectual, journalist, bureau chief, and columnist for the New York Times, who was twice awarded the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. His wife was Margaret Marshall, an activist attorney later appointed Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. All this testifies to Pitirim's love of beauty and of the natural world. Each year we spent nearly 2 months very close to nature amongst woods and fields of our old-fashioned summer place on Lake Memphremagog in Quebec, where swimming, fishing, country chores, and reading formed our chief amusements, in some a rather 19th century existence. Pitirim was often admired for being fearless while speaking against oppressive measures by powerful Soviet government officials, or by addressing the public through a series of editorials called The Notes of a Sociologist for Petrograd Party newspapers. Political activism formed a significant part of his story, lasting nearly to the end of his life. This began in northern Russia while he was still a teenager and extended into the early years of militant communism. It was intensive while he remained involved in politics, but this lessened after he agreed to give them up and turned to deeper reliance on scientific work. He was drawn much more strongly to intellectual rather than physical barricades, as I later could see for myself. During the post-World War II period of anti-communist hysteria in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation constantly went everywhere searching for communist sympathizers. They eventually launched a harassment campaign against American universities and began investigating their faculty members to root out undesirables. Sorokin was interviewed and responded vigorously, throwing in, for good measure, sharp criticism and advice for the Bureau's director. End of story. His strong advocacy of nuclear disarmament, whether comprehensively argued in Power and Morality or succinctly in letters to national newspapers and magazines, gave his views a significant audience. One published in the January 17, 1951 issue of the New York Times brought a same-day response from Albert Einstein, who asked permission to draw public attention to it by reprinting it as a full-page advertisement in the Times, together with endorsements by other prominent intellectuals that Einstein would select. This broadside appeared soon after, allowing the protest to reach a much wider audience. As the Vietnam War began to heat up, Pitirim was invited to speak at many college campuses and at a large anti-Vietnam teach-in at Harvard in the spring of 1965. His voice, and not those of the other speakers, galvanized the audience. For many, today's world is decidedly not what it should be. With war clouds scudding about everywhere, widespread unease from fear of violent breakouts, whether from unprovoked shootings and knifings at schools, concerts, and other public places, or for increases in sporadic attacks by terrorist groups, as well as sustained military engagements by armies in the Middle East and elsewhere. Largely due to great improvements in military hardware as compared to 30 years ago, civilians are now the main targets in all these conflicts. The many killed or maimed and a great rise in the numbers of refugees are the consequences. An enormous increase in drug dependency and upticks in the rates of suicide no longer are confined to certain disadvantaged groups, but are now spread worldwide and affect all social classes. This is further increased by easy access to highly addictive prescription drugs sold by unethical pharmaceutical companies anxious to increase their profits no matter what the human cost. So deeper analysis, hard science-based and macro-sociological, is needed to probe underlying changes in human social organization that permit this kind of outcome. In contrast, current practice among academic sociologists and professional societies tends to focus narrowly on politically relevant issues within isolated pieces of the whole social fabric, seeing inequalities in the opportunity accorded one group but not another as the leading cause of familiar problems. Whether they be in interracial and relationships, in arguments over assertions of gender identity and privileges, during protests against inequality in salaries paid to men and women, and so on. Inequality may be a factor, but making everything equal will not resolve the world's problems. Deeper understanding of human nature and the kind of values supported by the socio-cultural supersystem we live under may give us greater insight to understand them more adequately. Our present-day conflicts reflect characteristics of an increasingly disintegrating social fabric now existing in many countries of the world, not just in the West compared to 50 years ago. Meanwhile, attempts to resolve our present international conflicts continue to be guided by the age-old recourse to military bluster and fighting, still based on the sophistry that might makes right. But Pitirim Sorokin clearly saw altruism as offering a much better way and worked 10 years unceasingly and with some success trying to understand its nature and workings. He called for many natural and social scientists to enroll in the new discipline he called amitology, and in place of the angel who pointed the way out of the garden, he stood on the outside and pointed the way in. The challenge to comprehend its power and how this can be applied to help individuals and nations live peaceful lives remains the work of many years. An increasingly widespread number of reprints and translations of Sorokin's works in this arena suggest, however, that the spotlight he threw on altruism, its nature, origins, and role in social integration will become a significant and enduring aspect of his heritage.